We're here to educate and empower patients to make choices that are best for them. We're also here to decrease stigma around what it means to feel good and be high. Hence the H for hope, I for inspiration, G for growth, and H for healing. The Green Nurse is a holistic cannabis nurse that teaches on the endocannabinoid system and the safe utilization of cannabis and other progressive tools to help people reach a better quality of life.
I was cannabis agnostic for many, many years. And you know, the more research I did, the more I discovered the cannabis is this amazing medicine.
I was told that I had a 4-stage pancreatic cancer. The doctor really told me he couldn't do anything else. He gave me her name and she called me and she came to my house. She started to give me cannabis. My oncologist was puzzled because he couldn't find the cancer anymore.
All of the learning that we get comes from the Green Nurses Group, comes from their support, comes from their guidance. I trust everything that she says.
Simply meet people where they're at. The plant doesn't, stress to grow, so we don't stress to share it. We're healing people.
Cannabis has been used as a medicine for tens upon thousands of years. Here's the big message. Cannabis needs to be federally legal. We need to have laws that are the same across all 50 states that allow access to anyone and everyone who wants to utilize this powerful medicine.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Green Nurse Monthly Clinical Conversations webcast, where we bring hope and inspiration for growth and healing. The Green Nurse podcast Clinical Conversations came about when Nurse Elizabeth and I over here merged our companies Holistic Caring and the Green Nurse alongside of Bloom Hemp CBD, creating Holistic Caring Network. We are in our 8th year of podcasting and our 3rd year of clinical conversations, where we explore all aspects of how to optimize cannabis as medicine. We have a saying, and that saying is,
people are making great medicines, people are selling these great medicines, but nobody's interpreting how to clinically use cannabis as a medicine. And that's what we do.
That's right, that's what we do. And cannabis nursing has been recognized as a specialty, as nurses are truly making an impact on advocating for the safe therapeutic use of cannabis. Today's clinical conversation highlights a remarkable guest speaker, Steph Sherer, founder, board president, and executive director of Americans for Safe Access. Steph will deliver an insightful presentation on shaping federal cannabis policy, delving into the latest developments in emerging trends under the new administration. She will also explore the crucial role healthcare professionals, including doctors and nurses, and other healthcare professionals, and how they will play in influencing cannabis and cannabinoid policy on Capitol Hill. Don't miss this opportunity to gain valuable perspectives as these issues evolve. Steph Sherer is a leading international expert in medical cannabis advocacy. Her personal experience with cannabis benefits and political organization led her to establish Americans for Safe Access, also known as ASA, in 2002. ASA was founded to protect patients' rights and push for U.S. policy changes recognizing cannabis as a medicine. Today, ASA is the largest national organization focused on medical cannabis, working to close the gaps in knowledge, policy, and regulation to ensure access for therapeutic use and research. For over 2 decades, Steph has been a tireless advocate addressing patients' needs, dismantling political, social, and legal barriers. Her work has laid the groundwork for a national medical cannabis program and federal recognition of botanical cannabis medicines. She has challenged policies that perpetuate health inequities while developing solutions to bridge the gap between wellness and medicine. Under her leadership, ASA has achieved major milestones, including creating state medical cannabis programs, protecting state laws through litigation, and ending federal interference with these initiatives. She has also led efforts to establish federal policy protections for medical professionals, set product safety standards for the cannabis and hemp supply chain, and train regulators and workers on compliance. Steph Scherer's work extends again to federal and international levels, supporting the rescheduling of cannabis in the United States, providing the FDA with data to establish its currently accepted medical use and remove barriers to research. Internationally, she has worked with WHO to recognize cannabis benefits, leading to changes in global scheduling. After years of advancing federal cannabis framework abroad and reforming international drug treaties, Steph is returning as ASA's executive director. She will now lead a nationwide initiative to integrate cannabis-based medicines into the United States healthcare system, continuing her legacy of transformation and progress. We are so excited to have her here today. And just a little commercial, this webinar and clinical conversation session is proudly sponsored by Bloom Hemp CBD, Holistic Caring and the Green Nurse. Bloom Hemp is a woman and nurse-owned CBD emporium, champions of quality, safety, and patient-centered care. Bloom Hemp features organic CBD products formulated by doctors and nurses to target specific symptoms and is Ayurvedic inspired. Bloom Hemp also offers a free nurse line for patients. We have a pharmacist on staff, free emailed care plans with product recommendations and lifestyle tips. And that is our introduction. If anyone has questions, please hold it to the end. You will be able to ask questions. And now we are going to turn our clinical conversations over to our guest speaker, Steph Sherer. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. So we're just gonna sit here in silence and just moderate the room and just let you do your thing. And then afterwards, we'll field questions. There is a chat, and if people want to ask questions, they can just pop them in. And then afterwards, we'll answer them.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all you do for patients. So this presentation, I'm going to go over a lot of information, but along with the webinar being available, I'll also make this PowerPoint available to folks so you can let it sink in, but I'm definitely going to throw a lot of information at you. Okay. So right now, we really have a huge call to action for healthcare stakeholders. We need your voices on Capitol Hill and in this new administration to pave the way. So we're really talking about this next part of medical cannabis policy is expanding the definition of medicine. We're really talking about moving beyond sort of prohibition of cannabis and now looking at the other issue that cannabis has been facing, and that is a pathway for complex botanicals. And it's one thing for patients to talk about their experiences or lobbyists to talk about companies, but it's really healthcare stakeholders that are going to make this possible. So I really appreciate this opportunity to address your community. So Americans for Safe Access, everything we do is based on a patient's Bill of Rights. This is, obviously not very different from many other patient Bill of Rights. But for cannabis, we have a lot of specific elements around the product itself, around quality, making sure patients have accurate information about the products, that they have accurate information about laws. And so you'll notice sort of a theme through all of our work, that this is always what we come back to. And so at Americans for Safe Access, we've come together, we've brought together our stakeholders to build a regulatory framework that invests in the development of standardized cannabis-based products. So not the pharmaceuticalization, but but products that can be standardized, where you can have, a framework where nurses like Sherry and Elizabeth can do what they do and explain that gap. That there's a consistent supply, that it's actually integrated into patient treatment, not as a last-ditch effort, but as a frontline treatment. That it's covered by insurance, and that we move away from a time where we see discrimination in employment, housing, parental, and healthcare. And so for the framework of this, the way we define a medical cannabis patient, because every state has a little bit of a different description, we describe them as a person living with a medical condition or is experiencing symptoms for which cannabis or cannabinoid-based therapeutics is the only treatment option, a more suitable option or works as an adjunct treatment, including side effect mitigation to other available care. And so our goals for this year, there's a lot going on, but we've got to protect some of the ground that we've already won. We have to protect patients, educating them about information that's out there. We have to inform not only the broader public, but even ourselves of what's happening. We have to make sure we don't lose ground within this administration, and we have to be ready to advance policy. The only drawback of having a good argument to tear something down is to make sure you know what is going to be in its place. So again, this next step is really defining medicine, really bringing forward a new perspective, and this is where we really need healthcare stakeholders to join us in these efforts. So I'm going to tell you about some resources we have. I wanted to make sure to get these out of the way at the beginning, just so you can sit back while I'm talking and know that we have these resources available for you to do a deeper dive. But we've created, looking at the current market, knowing that patients, they may not be sure what they're using. We've created this amazing guide for consumers and patients to navigating this space. So this includes details about, not just side effects of cannabis, but also side effects of contamination. It includes sort of what their legal rights are. We've created checklists by markets, so we're not judging how patients get cannabis, because depending on where you are, who knows how you get it. I know my first cannabis was from a friend who listened to reggae music, so no judgment, but I just want to make sure you're safe. And so we kind of go through each of the markets and things that people should be looking for. And then we talk about the origin of contaminants, knowing that you could buy a product that isn't contaminated and contaminate it yourself. So just giving people some of that education and explain product safety standards. And then we explain how to read a label, how to read a certificate of analysis. And this is available in both Spanish and English. And so that's part of the protecting people, making sure people are safe. There's also a lot going on in this country right now, a lot of confusion. And so we want to make sure people know their rights and they're just safe if they do have a law enforcement encounter. Again, this Know Your Rights information is available in both Spanish and English. There's a lot going on around the rescheduling, which I'll get into in a minute. But we have a blog where we cover all of this in great detail. So know that if you ever need to figure out what is going on at this moment, you can find that there. And also for a deeper dive into things like why the hearings were postponed. On our YouTube channel, we do these little 30-minute lunch and learn education courses. So anything that's happening, in the news, usually we'll have a webinar to follow up. And just stay involved. We invite everyone just to get on our email list. We'll let you know when you need to show up somewhere, when there's hearings at the state level and at the federal level. And then we have a lot of resources to help you with your advocacy. So how to lobby Congress, how to lobby your state legislature, how to talk to the media. We also have lobbying information both for you to leave behind at your state regulators or your state legislators or your federal offices. And so with that out of the way, so know that there's lots of resources. So as I'm inspiring you to get involved, know that you're going to have help doing so. So what we're experiencing right now is a crack in a 50-year prohibition of cannabis, right? And so this includes changing the scheduling at the UN. This includes the current HHS findings. But this is really after 50 years of things being held as a complete prohibition, things are now finally changing. And so just to give you an idea of what we've seen in just the history of Americans for Safe Access, I founded the organization in 2002. At the time, there were 11 dispensaries in the country. They were all operating illegally at every level, by the way. There was 80% support nationwide. We had 8 states that had medical cannabis laws, but they were just criminal exemptions, which meant if you got arrested, you could show a letter to the judge. There were only 2 countries with medical cannabis laws. There were 30,000 medical cannabis patients in the whole country. DOJ, the Department of Justice, had started some actions against these state programs, both civil and criminal. There's no defense in federal court. So if you were arrested, you could not bring up the fact that it was a medical cannabis law. And by the way, that's still true today. If a new government decided to enforce cannabis laws, we kept hearing from the DEA that marijuana is not medicine, and that marijuana is a gateway drug, which is a fun one. And cannabis was, of course, Schedule 1 in the United States, which it is today, but it was also at the UN level, which has now changed. And the Department of Justice was threatening doctors, threatening to take away their license if they recommended cannabis. And so as a political organizer, when I became a patient, my natural step is to find the stakeholders. Who else cares about this issue, right? And so I went to healthcare stakeholders, right? We're talking about patients. So of course I'm thinking, let's talk to other healthcare professionals. And really what I found is that we were having a conversation about apples and oranges, right? A lot of the healthcare community was like, well, we don't really do federal civil disobedience medicine. So that's part of what led us to the states. But also the year before I founded Americans for Safe Access, there was a rescheduling denial. So remember, there's been several attempts to reschedule cannabis. And when I was talking to people in the cannabis space about this document, they kept referring to it as this propaganda document. But when I started reading through it, what I saw was a blueprint, right? They were saying it couldn't be rescheduled because we couldn't identify the constituent components, because there wasn't a product safety protocols for the supply chain, because cannabis was Schedule 1 in UN single treaties. So to me, that felt like a checklist. And I'll have to say, as a cocky 25-year-old, maybe I thought we were going to get through it much quicker. But that's really what was at the base of our activism. So with that in mind, we started, passing laws in the states. Nebraska is now a medical cannabis state. So the only one left is Idaho. So it's the only one that doesn't have some type of medical cannabis law, and the Samoa Islands. And this wasn't easy. I know we look at that state list and we're like, oh, look at all these states, but we had to not only pass the laws at the state level, but then we had to sue everybody to implement them. And I mean, every agency from CHP to DMV, every acronym to actually implement those laws. We had to, do a lot of public awareness campaigns about medical cannabis. We had to stop the federal raids so that we could actually implement these laws. And of course, we had to create product safety protocols. And so that's actually how we moved from criminal exemptions. Like what I said, when I first became a patient, there were these laws in place that said, if I had cannabis and I was arrested, I could show a letter from my doctor to a judge and they wouldn't convict me, but I would still lose my medicine. I would still get arrested. All of those things happen. And so when we put together this model of a state distribution program, what we found was that regulators were like, we don't know how to regulate cannabis. We don't know how to create a distribution program. So we partnered with the American Herbal Products Association and the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia to create a cannabis monograph and to create product safety protocols for the supply chain of cannabis. And that allowed us to then pass these statewide distribution programs that you see today. And so again, that wasn't an easy, it fits on a slide, but that was a painful 4-year consensus process with 176 cannabis companies where we cannabinized herbal medicine protocols and pharmaceutical agriculture protocols and turned them into protocols for cannabis. In passing the CJS amendment, that is an amendment to the Department of Justice's budget that keeps them from enforcing cannabis laws where there are medical cannabis laws. And again, this was not just something we did overnight. It took 10 years to pass legislation to stop these raids. And we had to continually, both show positive aspects of what was happening with medical cannabis, but also call out politicians that were on the wrong side of history. We had to, we tracked every single raid that happened and were able to put a dollar amount on that. We were able to, actually, this was a very fun project. We were able to challenge the DEA's misinformation about things like gateway theory, cognitive decline in adults, psychosis, and lung cancer, actually using their own words against them. So the 2015 or 2016 denial of the rescheduling that they issued, we actually took all of their findings in that document and used the Data Quality Act to challenge information that they had. So actually, no one in the federal government, NIDA, none of these organizations actually use gateway theory anymore. There's only some kind of aged out politicians that still use that terminology. We also, during the opioid epidemic, we were able to really expand a lot of the medical cannabis programs. Most of them didn't include pain as a qualifying condition. And that was because these state laws were first created, to keep as few people as possible from being a part of these programs. And so law enforcement worked really hard to keep pain out of them. And during the opioid epidemic, we were able to put forward a case to add cannabis and for states to use cannabis as a strategy to mitigate the impacts of the opioid epidemic. Then we saw the Farm Act, right? We saw this sort of confusing space. It was, there were people, farmers were advocating for years to be able to produce cannabis for foodstuffs, for plastics in the United States. They started those that activity way before CBD, but CBD access was, of course, one of the benefits from that. Then we saw during COVID, patients, we came together and pulled all the governors together and were able to get medical cannabis considered one of the essential businesses. But we were also able to get a lot of legislative items that we didn't have in states passed. So things like delivery and very important telehealth visits, which were banned in most states, we were able to get added during COVID. And the exciting thing was actually most of these advancements, they stayed after the emergency. So that was, patient advocates, we were ready to make sure people were protected, but also be able to advance patient access. And then finally, after we had to create an international coalition of patients organizations, we had to work with WHO, we had to work with the International Narcotics Control Board, but we were finally able to change the scheduling of cannabis in UN drug treaties. So both WHO and the UN recognize cannabis's benefits. And then we were able to have Biden actually move forward with asking for a re-examination of the scheduling. We were able to pass legislation, the Research Act in 2022, which a lot of people dismissed, but it did actually put some of the advancements we'd made into law within, as far as research is concerned. But we also, for the first time, created protections for medical professionals around cannabis recommendations. So before this was passed, most the protections for medical professionals were under actually the First Amendment, that they had the right to talk to their patients. Well, now the actual recommendations are completely protected under federal law. And then we saw, the FDA step out. Everybody was waiting for them to regulate CBD, and they came out and said that they needed a new pathway to do so. That they couldn't do it under the current framework. And then Americans for Safe Access, we worked closely with the FDA and HHS on the rescheduling petition. They used a lot of our data to be able to show that there was, in fact, accepted medical use. And then in 2023, we saw the INCB. This is the International Narcotics Control Board. They follow drugs around the planet, and they actually came out and said that it is legal for countries to have medical cannabis programs. So here we are. This is while there's a lot of things up in the air, the biggest thing to remember is that our top health agencies have found that cannabis has currently accepted medical use. And for, this may not seem like a big deal to people, but if you've been doing this for as long as I have, this is a validation in a way that, every time I see it, I tear up a little bit. And this is one of the major steps we've been working at. But for us, what we really thought this would mean would be Act 2, right? That we were waiting for this component so then we could figure out how to get this to patients. And so the next step, what's left in medical cannabis policy, is actually moving from what we have right now, which is a compassionate use model, right, which is really sort of up to everybody to figure it out on their own, to integration into our healthcare systems. But there are still some gaps, and this is part of the work that we're doing at Americans for Safe Access, and what we're hoping a new agency, the Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Control, would help facilitate. And that's standardizing terminology, creating new research tools, aligning some of the product protocols, and figuring out ways that healthcare stakeholders, researchers, product developers, patients, we can all speak the same language. And I have a feeling Sherry and Elizabeth are going to play a big role in helping us get there. So for 20 plus years, right, this is what we've been working towards, right, to create this national medical cannabis program. And the major two components of this would be an Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Control in HHS, not in FDA. I'll explain a little bit of that later, but FDA is a consumer protection agency that validates labels. And the truth is, like, we don't understand many of the conditions that cannabis actually treats, much less really understand the function of a complex botanical. So FDA might be involved later, but we're not there. We don't have a label yet for them to validate. And then the other component, which is sometimes seen as controversial, but that's only if you really think that cannabis is about to be descheduled. And that is creating a new schedule for cannabis and cannabinoids, Schedule 6. And this would go completely under the Office of Medical Cannabis. DEA would be taken completely out of cannabis policy. So this is sort of what this looks like. I'm not going to go into all of the subdivisions, but no, this the bill is actually modeled off of the creation of Homeland Security, because it creates a new office, but it also takes cannabis policy away from other agencies. So it basically creates one place where these policies can be set, and then it will work across other agencies, right, to explain what their role would be. So Schedule 6, and again, there's tons of this information on our website about what Schedule 6 would look like, but there would be no criminal penalties associated with Schedule 6 anymore. And so it doesn't do anything to the existing adult use programs. It doesn't regulate them. It doesn't do anything to them. That's somebody else's bucket of work. But I will say that medical cannabis has only held open the door for other uses of cannabis, including hemp. And it's really only other uses that have cut patients out more than the other way around. And so also in information, we can really break down what are the differences between like a Schedule 3, a descheduling, and Schedule 6. I think something that's really important to understand, one, is that descheduling is not about to happen. It is a very big political lift that is just not going to happen right now. But also, unless cannabis is classified in some way that shows it has accepted medical use, that's the only way that patients are going to fall under the protections of the American Disabilities Act, right? It's the only way that patients are going to get employment protections. It's the only way that we're going to see insurance coverage. And so, I definitely think that maybe, descheduling could be the next step later down the line, but we really need this codification. And I don't think that staying in Schedule 1 makes sense to wait for descheduling. And so, the legislation, it would be implemented in stages, but it would first staff up. It would actually start working on taking the current medical cannabis licenses that are in the state. If a company wants to participate and get a Schedule 6 license, they would tell their state regulator, and then they would be given a Schedule 6 license. And then all of the hemp licensees, if they want to produce products for cannabinoid products for human consumption, then they would also get a Schedule 6 license. And all of a sudden you would have legal B2B, meaning that anyone with a Schedule 6 license can work with anybody else with a Schedule 6 license, right? There would also be there's Schedule 6 and then Schedule 6A. And Schedule 6A is like over the counter. So CBD, for instance, we wouldn't need a special place to buy it. So it would still have the retail and online presence that it has today. It would just have product safety protocols. In the first 12 months, again, you start seeing some of these over-the-counter guidelines. And again, there's nothing in this law is going to disrupt what currently exists. So it's building on top of, right? So it's not going to prohibit any access or change it until the policy is in place. But I think what is exciting is it's going to standardize the labeling. It's going to standardize the testing, right? So people know what they're getting. And then we would see, another layer where you start seeing some of the more proactive work and actually, figuring out what would a prescription system look like for cannabis, right? Again, building on the ID cards, which are really burdensome for patients, right? Finding that specialty doctor and then paying an ID card, and then not being able to travel from state to state, or if you're on vacation and run out of medication. We all know those issues, but it would solve that. We would basically, if you have a a recommendation or a prescription from your doctor, you can travel around the United States as any other patient would. It's pretty exciting because I know it's really is hard to miss weddings or funerals because you can't travel with your medicine. And so the OMC, again, would help with some of those items I mentioned before, sort of closing that gap. But it's not going to, again, start from scratch. We're going to build on what we know and integrate and move cannabis further into our healthcare systems. And then it's going to tell all of the agencies what to do, right? It's going to, from day one, it's going to say, okay, HUD housing, you can no longer kick out patients for using medical cannabis. It's going to remove the requirement for, against using cannabis and having a gun, right? So all of those pieces in our society, and this is actually much longer in the legislation, and there's a copy of the legislation on the website. But I just wanted to give you an idea. So for Health and Human Services, it would inform all hospitals, healthcare clinics, rehabilitation centers, hospices, that they're not going to lose any funding or licensing to allow for cannabis use. It's actually going to direct CMS to start a plan for Medicaid coverage, right? So each agency is going to play their part, but it will all be orchestrated under the Office of Medical Cannabis. And again, this is sort of what I was talking about before. We're going to start with sort of phase one, building on the existing infrastructure, and seeing which of the current cannabis businesses and cannabinoid businesses want to participate in supplying patients. And then after that stage, then actually the Office of Medical Cannabis will determine, do we need to create new licenses? Is this enough, right? Are there enough people participating for access? And then there will actually be federal Schedule 6 licenses to fill in that gap. And again, these little markings are showing, there are lots of places where you won't need a specialized license, right? This will start integrating into our healthcare systems. And if a pharmacy would like to distribute cannabis, it can apply for a Schedule 6 license, but it won't need a license to sell CBD, if that makes sense, right? And then finally, we'd have just a system of trade, right? That includes import, export, includes, every sort of stakeholder would have their licenses in place, and we would see cannabis move through the existing lab system. So it would be hospital, pharmacies could have it, and we wouldn't see, anything separately. And for dispensaries, the current dispensaries, they would actually get Schedule 6 specialty pharmacy licenses. So which I know that a lot of patients and a lot of doctors, they don't want to just send a patient to a pharmacy, right? They will actually want someone there to help them with that care. So I think just like other specialized treatments, the specialty pharmacy is going to play a huge role in really utilizing cannabis. And so now I'm just going to jump into kind of where we are right now. Like I said, I'm going to be going through a bunch of information, but I'll make this available. So as I said before, we just have one state, one territory without cannabis laws. We have, surveys of like 2/3 of clinicians, saying that they believe that cannabis has medicinal value, but just over a quarter of them are actually recommending them to patients, right? So that's exciting from when I started, where I couldn't even get a doctor or a researcher to put their name on on a pamphlet or on a research guide. Then I think the impact that the opioid epidemic had on this country is that really the opioid epidemic was a symptom of the pain epidemic, right? But really what we started seeing is people dying, right, from that epidemic. And it really opened the minds of a lot of clinicians to realizing that they need more options to treat their patients, right? This had a huge impact on the willingness of people to participate. And then we have this huge problem of these chronic conditions that have no treatments, right? We're seeing, polypharmacy being used incorrectly and being used, in sort of a scary way, but we can't handle this expense, right? And so we know that governments are looking for new solutions. We also have great data on patients substituting, cannabis for, not just pain, but also, opioids, for sleep aids, for muscle relaxants. And we're really able to show that data in real time. And so what we're hoping is that while we may not be talking about apples or oranges, maybe we're ready to move forward with grapes, right? That's sort of what the Office of Medical Cannabis policy is. The Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Act would create this space that allows us to get a medication to patients that we know is safe, that we can, as we move forward, start understanding. So where we are right now, we have these silos of information about cannabis, right? We have research happening over here that's being, they're using products that nobody is using. There's not a standardized terminology. So that's, what medical professionals are being taught isn't necessarily what their patients are getting, right? And the same thing with product development is happening in its own silo, maybe away from research. And so we also have these regulated markets that are all regulated at different stages. Then we have the unregulated market, which there's a lot of amazing companies in that space, but it's hard to see who those are sometimes. We also have a situation where we saw in this last election where people are framing medical cannabis as the goal of that adult use is the goal of medical cannabis, that's what we've been working on. But that framing is really frightening. We know that there are a lot of people that are left out of these medical cannabis programs, people living in hospice, people living in assisted living, veterans, active military, federal employees, although I think there's just going to be 2 left in a couple weeks. Just kidding, sorry. Then we also know that these state programs aren't meeting medical cannabis patients' needs, and that's because they were never meant to be the permanent solution. We created these state programs, these distribution programs, as a triage. Remember when I showed you where we were with the scheduling of cannabis? We couldn't wait to get those items figured out while we knew people were suffering. But now a lot of the symptoms that we're seeing in the state programs is the fact that they weren't meant to be permanent, right? That they were triage. And if you leave a patient in triage for too long, they're going to get infected, right? And I think that's what we're starting to see. And in a way, Congress has determined who has access, and by passing the CJS amendment, right, and allowing those who actually can afford access in the states. But they're also saying none of these people can have cannabis. And so we still have, denials of services, as I mentioned before, subsidized housing, veterans benefits, Medicare reimbursement, people not being able to travel, relocate for work, go to college. There may be patients, younger patients may not be able to go to the college that they want because there isn't a medical cannabis program there. Healthcare autonomy, as I mentioned before, the protections of the American Disabilities Act, and then our Second Amendment rights. We know that the adult use programs are pushing out patients, that, it's not because there's some enemy or something horrible happening. It's just the reality of these geo-fenced markets. People have to pay payroll, and when they go to serve the adult use community, there's only so much shelf space, and unfortunately, patients' products are the first to go. And people ask me, why, a lot of people think that if you just get if you have adult use, then patients are fixed, everything's fine for patients. But there's still a lot of issues, right? These state laws for adult use, they don't deal with discrimination and stigma. They don't deal with patients between the ages of 18 and 21. And they don't, provide expertise. A lot of people are walking into adult use space with no knowledge of cannabis, and leaving with high THC products that are really causing problems. And so part of the sort of demand for hemp products, part of this is because people are left out of the state programs. So people who weren't able to get an ID card are finding these, some of these products. The adult use programs aren't helping patients. And right now, there's not a credible source for cannabis, right? The federal government blew it with their reefer madness, but nothing has sort of come in place. So a lot of times people hear information, negative information about cannabis, and they think it's propaganda. And so now we have the hemp versus, adult use wars. I call it the war of glass houses. That yes, there are a lot of products that are, on the hemp market that haven't been tested. Their safety profiles haven't been tested, but the same is true of a lot of the products that are in dispensaries. I don't think there's a safety profile for shatter. So, I think people should be careful with that, because what's happening is patients are losing out. And so California is a perfect example, right? Where you had the governor make a knee-jerk reaction to these unregulated products. And because it's so expensive to produce high CBD products in the regulated market, those state licensed producers stopped making it. So here you had a situation where they're banning certain products, but not ensuring that patients were going to have access. That's my little California flag. So we also have, cannabis businesses that are really struggling to stay open. So maybe they're cutting corners. There's a lot of pressure to pay payroll. But we also have patients who are being left out of these markets. So no one's happy. But we do have bipartisan support for medical cannabis. Let's not forget that. We did, and not this last Congress, but the Congress before, we passed the research bill with bipartisan support. But unfortunately, we didn't see medical cannabis legislation in the last Congress. And that was because many of our champions felt like they didn't need to do anything, right? They felt like if they just move forward with adult use legislation, that patients would be helped. Or they thought Schedule 3 was going to somehow make cannabis fall into our pharmacies and, fix all of these issues. And part of this problem is because patients weren't talking to their elected officials, because medical professionals weren't a voice. Right? You have to remember, if you are not talking to your member of Congress about cannabis, that doesn't mean nobody's talking to them, right? They are getting lobbied from law enforcement. They're being lobbied by the cannabis industry, the hemp lobbyist. They're being lobbied by now the addiction industrial complex, which is, I think, almost the size now of the prison industrial complex. They're being lobbied by drug testing companies. So if they don't hear from you, right, this is what our champions believe, right? So just think about what our opponents believe. And now we also have this, this sort of public health backlash about cannabis and about these products. And part of that is because of the addiction industrial complex, putting out information that people are using cannabis daily, more than alcohol, which is a stupid comparison in the first place. But we have cannabis businesses repeating that information, to increase stock prices, right? When we know the reason people are using cannabis every day is because they're replacing sleep aids and anti-inflammatories. But that's not the message it's getting out. And with a prohibition mindset, right, if you believe that cannabis is harmful, then that information is pretty scary to you, right? If you don't know better. And so then we saw the rescheduling process, that we were at administrative hearings. So, HHS had said that they thought it should be Schedule 3. It was sort of moving through this process that is described in the Controlled Substance Act. And, there was a lot of misinformation about what scheduling would actually do. And this was a very frustrating time for me when this information came out, because I've been working on this for 23 years, right? To me, this is like I said, Act 2. But all of the media coverage was focused on Biden and Trump, that if this was somehow a political tool of Biden, or it was focused on tax exemptions for cannabis businesses, which wouldn't have happened anyway. But this was really just supposed to be the game changer, so we could actually stop saying, is it medicine, and talk about getting it to patients. But a lot of people didn't even really look at what the Department of Justice was recommending. They weren't just saying all of cannabis go into Schedule 3. They actually had left a lot of things in Schedule 1. And so, people weren't really taking a critical look at what was even being proposed for the rescheduling. And then, the Department of Justice was very clear. Sorry, I've got to jump there. In saying that, if cannabis is moved into Schedule 3, that it would still, the only things that would be legal would be regulated Schedule 3 products, right? So everything that we're doing in the states is outside of the Controlled Substance Act. So if with the Schedule 3, still everything that we were doing in the states would remain illegal, right? So there was always going to be work to do. And so really, from this whole rescheduling process, we got what we needed as medical cannabis advocates the moment FDA and HHS said there was accepted medical value. Now we have to go create a proper scheduling and these other things. But still it moves on. And, part of the currently accepted medical findings, came from a new approach that HHS took to describing accepted medical use. And, the DEA objected to this finding. But the courts, the Justice Department for the DEA said, no, that this is actually acceptable. And in fact, the criteria before was ridiculous, right? There was no way that cannabis would be able to meet that criteria. So they upheld this two-part inquiry. But these hearings are postponed, and I'm not going to take a lot of time here to talk about that. Just know it's a little bit of political maneuvering, maybe some egos. But what we're not sure is what happens next, right? So there are hearings that are scheduled about some of the process around the hearings happening. So the DEA could actually just get rid of those appeal, like that whole process, by putting out a new notice for proposed rulemaking. So going all the way back to where we were in March. If the current OLC ruling stays in place, then they have to move forward with Schedule 3. But they could also go back further, right? With a new Department of Justice, they may issue a different ruling saying that the two-part inquiry doesn't work and send it back to HHS. So there's a lot of unknowns here, right? We don't really know what is going to happen. But again, as patient advocates, we already got what we wanted, right? There's accepted medical value. We don't like the system anyway. So, because the media was so focused on taxation and politics and not about patients and rescheduling, there was really a resurgence in the anti-cannabis lobby, right? And we saw that on Capitol Hill. We saw a measure passed in the CJS appropriations, the budget for the Department of Justice. One thing that passed, it was going to stop the rescheduling efforts altogether. Another thing that passed was actually a crawlback to our protections that would actually open up the door for federal enforcement in medical cannabis states. But this kind of got cleared because we moved into a new session of Congress, but it was pretty scary, right? That even passed. considering for over a decade, we've been able to continue those protections year after year. But the day after those kind of scary amendments were passed, we saw a letter from 25 Republicans to the Attorney General admonishing him for the Schedule 3 finding. And the reason I'm mentioning that, it'll come around, wait for it. But we also saw, the DEA during this time has said that kind of challenging whether THCA meets the definition of hemp. A lot of these have been dismissed in federal courts, but it gives you an idea of sort of where the DEA's mind is on hemp. Then, of course, we saw amendments to the hemp law in the reauthorization of the Farm Bill that would basically take all the cannabinoids off the table except for CBD. And again, this all kind of got wiped clean with the new session of Congress. But these, this is a foot, right? That they're really going to strip out the extent of the hemp bill. And then we had both hemp and adult use lobbyists asking Congress to regulate cannabis like tobacco under the FDA, which would be the worst, right? It would, for the non-medical components, you can look and see what FDA did to tobacco products, and know that in order to get a new tobacco product on the market, you basically have to have the equivalent of a new drug application information. And for medical cannabis, it sends us back to the beginning, right? They say the only way that you can have a medical cannabis medicine is if it's FDA approved. And so a lot of the legislative proposals we saw for cannabis included putting cannabis in the FDA. So this is a challenge for us. And I wasn't that worried about it because I don't think we're anywhere close to passing adult use legislation at the federal level, but we started seeing it in some of the hemp bills. And so that's where I was getting a little nervous. I already said that. But this is my biggest fear, right? Is that we did all this work to remove the Controlled Substance Act as a barrier, and now we get stuck in the FDA. Because part of the reason we went to the states was because of this sort of square peg round hole issue at the FDA of being able to evaluate cannabis medicines. And we know that, in this country, FDA approved means medicine. I mean, that's not a reality anywhere else on the planet, but my grandmother would definitely have disagreed with that. But this is sort of what opens the door to our healthcare infrastructure. And for FDA has said that, cannabis has to go through the botanical drug development process, for FDA approval. And we know that's just not going to work, right? Only 3 drugs now, this is wrong, have made it through that process, and they're all single compound extractions, right? They're all following that magic bullet drug development process. A lot of people are excited about presidential candidates talking about cannabis, but the truth is they can't do anything about actual cannabis policy, right? They can do some things within the administration, but not actually change the CSA. That has to happen through Congress. Then this administration, kind of their unofficial Bible is Project 2025, and don't read the whole 900 book unless you want nightmares. But part of what they're talking about is actually going into states where they disagree with state laws and enforcing federal laws, and actually reigniting RICO. And they talk specifically about drug policy and actually starting to prosecute individuals. So we don't, nothing has happened in this, but this is sort of what's in the background of this administration. The new pick for DEA is very anti-cannabis. And so we're not going to see a buddy there. And, if you look at, the sort of party lines within the states that have these programs versus sort of where we are in these policies, I think there's a lot of Republicans that may sacrifice their program, right, if it falls under party line or party push. And we did see in the last Congress legislation that was introduced, it didn't make it very far, but that would prohibit transportation funding to states with adult use programs. So that's how we got seatbelts. That's how we got the 21 drinking age was actually prohibiting transportation use. Okay, so remember I said, hold on, when I highlighted those people that had signed that letter? Well, they're all now in leadership, right? So Thune was a signatory of that letter. Capito, they now are going to be running the Senate, running what is decided on, but are also, you know, chairs of committees like the CJS subcommittee in Senate. So, you know, if the House decides to move something forward, they're going to have allies on the other side. And this is you know, people may not remember this, but a lot of people went to jail for supplying medical cannabis. I know there's a lot of new folks that think that this was something that was crazy that happened under Bush maybe, but actually most of it happened under Obama, right? So this was patients that stopped these raids from happening, but we have a new era. So everything is up in the air, which can be exciting, right? We can move forward. But as I sort of showed, we're kind of under fire, right? Like we can't, there's not a period now where we're just sitting back and letting things move forward. So it's time to educate, activate, mobilize. And that means retelling the history of medical cannabis, not just from the war on drugs, but on the history of medicine, right? Like there is this other history of cannabis that isn't just about this political war. You know, telling the story of like explaining why there isn't an FDA approval process, right? Taking the time to educate people, not just because, you know, of reefer madness, but actually like science hasn't caught up to really explain why cannabis works, right? Explaining that pharma is not going to come fix this problem, right? There's not this, you know, cannabis is a generic drug. There's not you know, pharma is isn't interested in making a profit. They're interested in making an obscene profit. And that's just not going to happen with cannabis. You know, we always have, you know, politicians pointing to the prescription drugs that are available. Well, we know why they don't work. We know, but there hasn't been an investment in explaining that, right? Most of that money has gone to prove the harms. So another, you know, when politicians are asking you, well, why aren't drug companies stepping up to do this? Well, I love this study that just came out last year looking at FDA approved drugs, and actually out of 356 of the last 358 drugs, they depended on an investment of $1.4 billion of NIH in preclinical. That hasn't happened for cannabis, right? No pharma company is going to start from step one, but there was an investment of about 1.4 billion from NIH. It just all went to proving the harms, right? So there is a reason, like, you know, this is explainable beyond war on drugs. And there's a global movement right now looking at plant medicines, like coming back and saying, look, the diseases that we are facing now will not be solved by magic bullet strategies, right? And so there's a resurgence that isn't just about the United States. And again, when these things get brought up to you, there's a way to explain it. Explain that people are using, you know, using cannabis for substituting other drugs. That's why they're using it every day, not because of alcohol. But there's a real, you know, I have a real fear that when we look at the inequality of research, that, you know, since 1968, there's been billions of dollars spent on proving the harm. And there's a real, you know, fear that we could go from proving the harms of cannabis under prohibition to just proving the harms of cannabis under public health. It's all the same players, right? It's all the same researchers. They just change one word in their grants, right? And we're still waiting for the investment in a real investment in cannabis therapeutics. And again, you know, shake up this timeline that people look at, right? I love, you know, telling people that, you know, if you think of morphine and these drugs, we used them before we understood everything about the endocrine system, right? We didn't discover and really even understand endorphins until 1975, but we have been taking these products forever. And cannabis, you know, I want to reintroduce this idea that maybe cannabis is just right on time, right? And so I think, again, looking at the sort of response that we saw of, you know, this idea that currently accepted medical use is political, I think right now what we can do is really turn that on its head and bring information that's, maybe where these people don't have to be wrong about, maybe HHS could have been right in 2015 when they said there was no accepted medical use, and be right in 2023. I mean, I don't believe that, but I'm just saying, one of the rules of politics is that it's easier to win if your opponent doesn't have to be wrong. And so looking at, the rescheduling petition in 2015, that was based on data from 2011, right? That's what HHS was responding to. And so, part of what's exciting is saying, okay, let's not go back to the pyramids to explain the medical use of cannabis, right? We can start at 2011. And actually, at that point, there were 16 states with medical cannabis laws, but only 13 were operating. Only 5 had distribution programs, right? So we've learned a lot since 2011. We jumped from, maybe about 1 million medical cannabis patients to over 6 million during that time. We were able, during this period of time is when we created the product safety guidelines. The cannabis monograph came out. That wasn't a part of the discussion before 2011. Then you have, we passed all of these state laws that included these review boards to add conditions. And this is actually part of what the Office of Legal Counsel upheld the DEA's or HHS's finding, was basically because there was, it wasn't just something political. There was more to states allowing medical cannabis use. And in fact, from those review boards, we had over 65 qualifying conditions added to the states that went through a process of, health agencies reviewing all the data and saying there is enough research here to say that, doctors should be able to recommend cannabis. This wasn't some political process, right? We also, in 2016 was the first time we saw, the Federation of State Medical Boards put out a decision tree on how to determine if your patient needs cannabis, right? They actually started getting guidance from within about how to utilize cannabis. 2017 is when we got this amazing report, which nobody has followed the recommendations of, but that we had, the National Academy saying there is conclusive evidence, right, that cannabis can help pain and nausea, vomiting, and MS and spasticity symptoms, right? That's conclusive. Conclusive. I love that word. We don't get to see it much. Then we had, of course, the pain epidemic, right? And we had all of these states really using cannabis as a tool to combat this crisis. And some of this is something I've already mentioned, but I want to kind of put this history back together for you in a way that is, again, it's new. Cannabis isn't some old idea. It's new, right? This is all happening in recent time. We have 2023. We have, Minnesota Department of Health put out this amazing guidance on dosaging guidelines. Then, as I mentioned before, INC board said, yes, have medical cannabis programs. And then, of course, 2023, we have ANA officially recognizing cannabis nursing as a specialty practice. Yeah, exactly. So this is what led to this finding, right? It wasn't that it just was political. It wasn't about an election. But there are also lots of people are on our side. The Congressional Research Service, which is what Congress turns to for guidance on policy, they have said that maybe you should create another schedule. That is their advice as well. They've said maybe you should find another framework, right? So again, this isn't something crazy that I just thought up of my own. I mean, sometimes that happens, but not often. But let's also lead with, we're not alone, right? This isn't cannabis only organizations. There are many patient organizations and veterans organizations that want to see medical cannabis advance. So bring those into your conversations. Actually, everyone is looking at Congress right now to do something, right? To figure out a way forward, because this is a mess. And so we're going to be introducing the Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Act in this Congress. I'm currently working with Ledge Council, so you can get involved and working on that. We have lots of data, information to help you explain Schedule 6 in your advocating. So don't worry, I'm not going to just leave you hanging there. And again, we have tons of information, right? We have a whole FAQ, so you can dive in. I'm always available to answer questions. But again, at the state level, we still have to, make sure that we're not losing, what patients, what patient care we currently have, but also start preparing the states for, for federal legislation, right? We have to, one of the projects we're doing is actually not waiting for the federal legislation to pass, but we're starting to create recommendations for regulators on how to fill these gaps. So we're working with healthcare stakeholders from around the globe to start answering these questions. And so in the same way we figured out product safety protocols, we're figuring out these gaps as well. We don't have to wait. This is Medical Cannabis Awareness Week, so I'm excited to be here during this week. So you can look at our website for all sorts of activity. I've created a playlist on our YouTube channel of all sorts of fun videos from the past. We have our Put Patients First campaign, kind of pulling off of our president's campaign messaging, but of all sorts of activities that you can do. If you have 1 minute, if you have 30 minutes, there are things that the president can do without Congress, including allowing VA doctors to recommend. These are all actions he can take. And there's lots of, little actions. So we tell you how you can get that to him. This is a time to write letters to the editor. Don't wait. Don't let other people, control this dialogue. You all have something to say. So we've taken all the guesswork out of it. So you can go to our website. We'll tell you actually how to email them, how many words. We even created some draft letters for you. So it's all there. Again, we have these little actions for each of them that allow you to put them on your social media campaigns. We have a petition we would love for you to sign. So if you've got, it says 1 minute, but really it takes like 1 second. And then if you don't know how to get a hold of your federal legislators, we've broken that down as well. You can, all you need to know is your address. If you don't know that, I can't help you. But if you know your address, then you put it in the system and it will tell you who your senators are and you can write them. There's a pre-written letter that you can modify and your representative. We have social media campaigns you could do. And then if you belong to an organization that wants to be a part of this effort to change federal laws, you can go on and endorse our legislation and endorse the campaign and become a major player in that. Sorry, this is the petition I already talked about. And so our national campaign is safe access for all, that's what we're working towards. And I think we're closer than ever, right? And again, anytime the chessboard is brought up into the air, that means opportunity. And I'm coming back to this call to action. Like, I'm an activist. I'm an organizer, right? My job is to pull together stakeholders. But I did not go to medical school, as much as I have sorted through research. And it really matters in this country. White coats have a different sort of power when it comes to health policy, and we can't do it without you. So I can provide you the resources to make sure you know how to talk to your elected officials, who to talk to, give you fact sheets, but we're really going to need warm bodies doing this work if we're going to move forward. And of course, we could always use financial support. As you can imagine, I'm not getting any federal grants. A lot of time this work happens through my credit cards, so can always use a little help in pitching in. And that's it. So, woo, I did it in the time slot. Look at that.
Okay, because we're both in the same room, so sometimes the computers yell at each other. Go back and forth. That was absolutely amazing. That was wonderful. If you would want to just close out your screen so we can see you, we do have a couple questions that I'll just read right from the notes here. If anyone has any other questions, it would just be easier for you to put them in the Q&A as opposed to us bringing you on. So the first question we have is from Lenora. And she said, in a better world, could cannabis simply be descheduled, or is Schedule 6 potentially beneficial?
That's a great question. That's a great question.
We already know that, but we want an answer.
No, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, the answer is that that perfect world would include changing how we define medicine and protections for patients under medicine. So And you think about, parental rights, employment rights, right? So what we're seeing in states that have, adult use programs, people can still get fired for using cannabis. So if we're going to want, so I think that that a Schedule 6 as a step to establish product safety protocols, to standardize labeling, is a helpful effort for sure. And I love thinking of perfect worlds, but unfortunately I get brought back into this one pretty quickly.
I do love Schedule 6, and it makes sense the way that ASA has it laid out. To me, it's the only thing that makes sense because it does protect the patients.
And it's interesting. We first there was an iteration of this legislation that had cannabis in like a Schedule 5A, but what we found is that there is just so much other policy around the existing schedules that just made, like, we didn't want DEA involved at all. And so the only way to remove DEA was to create a new schedule, because there is a role for DEA in the other schedules. So
yeah. And so one of the other questions that we have is, as a clinician who is new to the cannabis industry, I appreciate the educational resources offered by ASA. The confidence to answer questions with accurate information is key to consumer trust in my business. I'm still trying to establish my role in activism, but understand the urgency of now. Can you provide a few key talking points that I can mention as I am networking with other clinicians who might be interested in joining this movement or getting Schedule 6 licensing?
Got 1 minute, got 5 minutes, all of those talking points.
Yeah. I think, I think that, and I definitely have matured as an advocate during this time as well. But part of that maturity has been being comfortable with saying we don't know everything, but we know enough to move forward, right? And so if you look at aspirin, for instance, we actually don't know why aspirin both reduces fever and relieves pain, right? It was grandfathered in, but the reason that we haven't waited for science to catch up to explain its dual activity, but we know it's safe. And so I think for other clinicians, what I say is that, don't you want more options for your patients? And don't you want that option to not kill them? Right? Like, that's a pretty big opportunity. And I think what I run into with a lot of medical professionals is just this, polypharmacy and this sort of de-prescribing is now a new trend, right? Like, what can you take your patients off of? And that's, looking at, trying to use many drugs to address these complicated conditions, but then having to deal with the fallout of all of these side effects. And so I think that what is exciting about cannabis as an option is that your patients are going to find relief, but that they also are going to have some control. So a lot of the education that we give to patients is actually based on insulin education, diabetes education, to explain, that you're not going to react to this medication the same way someone else does. And so, and as you get better, as your endocannabinoid system starts aligning, you're going to need something different, right? It's going to change. And, you may get to a point where you only need to use a medication a couple times a week. And that is not an option for most medications. So it's pretty exciting.
Our endocannabinoid system changes over time as we change, which is very, very interesting. And Dr. Raphael Machulam actually answered a text message of mine on LinkedIn years ago when I first started. And I had that epiphany, because I at one point in time was on 18 pharmaceuticals, and polypharmacy is if you're on 5 or more pharmaceuticals, there's a 50% chance that they're interacting. 10 or more pharmaceuticals, 100% that they're interacting and not in your best and highest interest. And so he so graciously answered that question, that yes, as time goes on, as you start to support and nourish your endocannabinoid system, your cannabinoid requirements over time will definitely change. Another question we have is, this is from a nurse. When you say get involved, what can we do as nurses? Where do we start?
Wonderful. Well, first, you can sign up to get on our listserv. But I think one of the big things is just educating people around you. The resources from ANA are game changing, right? To have something that isn't I mean, like I said, the first pamphlets that I created when I started Americans for Safe Access, I broke up the different conditions, because I knew, when you see like a long list of conditions, it sounds like snake oil, right? So I just started breaking things up into the different categories, but I couldn't even get a doctor to put their name on something they helped me write. They're like, no, now people steal my stuff all the time and put their names on it, but that's another story. But I think, giving colleagues the resources that allow them to feel comfortable talking about medical cannabis, and just holding space, just letting people answer questions in a place where they don't have to feel dumb. Sometimes the cannabis community isn't always so nice. So someone might ask a question, about a reaction that they're having with cannabis, and people just, jump on them. Right, everyone, I will say, one of the symptoms of the prohibition of cannabis is black and white thinking, right? That there's either or, right? And I'm sure as medical professionals and as someone who works in politics, there's no such thing. And so really, holding the space and answering their questions, letting them know there are no dumb questions, and that part of, practicing in this space is being uncomfortable with explaining the unknowns. That a lot of science right now is just quantifying the unknown, right? That's really part of diagnosing, but it's also part of finding out how we can move something forward in society. And I think the other ways that you can get involved are, writing letters to the editor, and the easiest thing is like when you see a story that you hate, right? This is what I always tell people. And instead of just like yelling, like just type what you're yelling, right? And get it back to the editor, because they may not know. Also know that right now there are, this is a horrible time for media. There are 8,000 less reporters today than there were in 2020. Right? They have no investigative budgets. So sometimes they're just reprinting what they have. So they're probably going to love to hear from a nurse, actually, with the perspective of what is actually there, right? And, meet with your members of Congress. We make it as easy as possible. We're going to have some lobby days coming up. So if you want to venture to DC, but you're right. Actually, right now, your members of Congress are at home. They're on recess. So if you look around, you might go into their Facebook and see that they may be having a town hall. Maybe your senators are there to hear from you. And one of the other points I want to make about politicians is everyone has opinions about politicians, but they are people. They are humans, and they have kind of a really not so great job. But their job description isn't come to DC and protect the laws of your state. Their job description is to represent their constituents. So if they don't hear from you, they have no obligation to care about cannabis. I just want I want to put it on you, but it's kind of on you. So.
That's good. And then a couple other questions. There's a couple of questions in this one question. Thank you for all the work so far. Question 1. Would a Schedule 6 regulate CBD like a nutritional supplement?
No, because there would actually be product guidelines, and it would be included as a medicine. So because it would fall under Schedule 6, which would have accepted medical use, it would actually be treated as a medicine, which means that you could get insurance coverage. And, I really see what we're doing right now with medical cannabis, right? If we're able, when we pass this legislation, cannabis will become a gateway drug. It will become the gateway drug to bringing other herbal medicines over into our healthcare system. So I think, the dietary supplement, when DSHEA passed, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act in 1994, it was done under fire also. But one of the things that happened is there was a movement in this country to create a tranche at FDA for herbal medicines. And during the drafting of DSHEA, the word herbal medicine got thrown into the definition of dietary supplement. And so what happened with that sort of movement is everyone's like, well, you mean I don't have to do clinical trials? I can just put out my supplement without any of that work? Yeah, I'm going to go do that now, right? And so it really took the legs under that movement. And one of my biggest fears is that adult use could be doing that for medical.
Agreed. Okay, another question under the same person's question was, the endocannabinoid system is not taught alongside other bodily systems in basic biology classes. Would OMC require this vital knowledge for all science students and HCPs, healthcare professionals?
Yeah, so one of the projects that we're working on, we have a project called the Cannabis and Cannabinoids Medicines Initiative. And part of that is actually creating those recommendations for regulators that I mentioned before. But we're also, looking at, instead of having standalone endocannabinoid system education, integrating it into every level of pre-med. And I actually know someone I'm working with that actually is introduced a course into Maryland 8th grade biology about the endocannabinoid system. But I think one of the biggest challenges is that nutrition isn't a requirement in pre-med, and nurses take it, but most doctors don't, right? And so explaining the endocannabinoid system without an understanding of nutrition can also be a challenge. So within the language of the Office of Medical Cannabis, under the Department of Science and Health, that is one of the requirements, is actually integrating it not as a standalone education, but integrating it into, when you learn about the endocrine system, understanding. And maybe one of the positive things out of us passing the Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Act would be nutrition being a requirement in medical care.
Yep. Yeah, because if the endocannabinoid system is the most important system in our body that regulates all 11 organ systems, our immune system, and all the neurotransmitter signaling systems, it kind of makes sense that we teach that system first. And I actually know too, my daughter's in pharmacy school, first year pharmacy school. Her third week in the first year of pharmacy school, she was sending me shots of the endocannabinoid system. They were teaching it. So I was pretty blown away. I was really, really very pleased to see that she's learning that. Okay, the same question. No tax on other medicines, so no tax on cannabis medicine? Question mark.
Tax, no tax.
Yeah.
No tax on cannabis medicines. Yeah.
And then hybrid lobby day, in person as well as digital. Costs, logistics, issues for many? Question mark. I'm not sure.
One, your members are at home as well. So meeting them in their home office is always an opportunity. There's also all sorts of, fun activities like meeting them at town halls, bringing your lobbying out in the public. And, when we have lobby days, we also provide patients opportunities to do fundraising for their travel. So, we provide kits for people to help fundraise. There have been times when I've been able to raise enough money to bring people and offer scholarships. That isn't the situation we're in right now. You could help with that. But know that you don't have to come to DC to be heard. Of course, we love having a big turnout, but it's not just finances for a lot of our patients. Just being able to leave their home. A lot of us, I feel like I'm still living in the pandemic. I cannot get COVID, like so many people with autoimmune disorders and neurological disorders. And so we know that's not a possibility for many. So no, you don't have to travel to DC to be heard. And there's all sorts of activities that you can do to bring more voices to DC. So before you come to DC, you can have, people send you a picture with their story and deliver, all of these messages to a member of Congress.
Excellent. And then finally, the last question of that question was, unpermitted grows, like Thailand, can we confiscate, clean, and make it into medicine? Question mark.
I guess it depends on how good their record keeping was, right? Because I think that there's, and you can look at the guide that I showed you before to understand sort of all the places that contamination can happen. And I think all cannabis should be tested before it's destroyed to understand a lot more about what we're seeing in society of people that were taking it. but it's pretty hard without testing the soil, the water, to take something that was confiscated and putting it into medicine. And I really want to get people out of this idea that compassion means leftover cannabis, right? So all of these state programs that and companies that have expired cannabis for veterans, or this idea that compassion means that a patient walks in and there's like these certain products that they're going to give you. That's called leftovers. That's not compassion, right? Like, patients deserve medication that they need, not just what is left over that other people don't want. So I just want us to get out of that mind frame.
Yep.
I know
And-
people want to be helpful, but it's not. Like, it's yes, I think also what we're experiencing with the adult use programs is what people like even Robert Randall, sort of the godfather of cannabis. He was using cannabis recreationally and learned that it helped with his glaucoma, right? But I think if you think about how unhealthy this country is, how messed up our endocannabinoid systems are because of bad diet, not sleeping, stress, all of those things, if cannabis is introduced into your life, it's going to change your life, right? And so maybe you just used it to go to a concert, but then the next morning you wake up and you're like, oh, I didn't need to take an anti-inflammatory, that people may start using cannabis more often. But I think it's we really need to understand the endocannabinoid system more to be able to understand why people are using it and when.
Okay, and then we just want to give a big shout out to Nectar Ball. We've got Mark and Patty Schultz here. They said, and he put in a comment, EMAC and Nurse Heather are in our new award-winning educational documentary, Nectar Ball, The Story of Cannabis, now free to watch. So that's also linked there as well. He also writes, 12 Black Cannabis Visionaries, 38-minute award-winning documentary, free to watch for Black History Month now. And there's a link to that on Red Coral Universe, so please share with others. Nectar Ball, The Story of Cannabis, feature-length award-winning documentary at many of your favorite platforms. So thank you, Patty and Mark Schultz, for being here. We are very, very grateful. This webinar was recorded, and so you will get an email of this actual recording after, 1 hour after. This recording will also be going up on our YouTube channel, and we are also on Red Coral Universe. We have been Green Nurse Podcast, Living Your Best Life, has been syndicated, so that will also be there as well. And Steph also let us know that she will be sharing with me her PDF. So I have a copy of everyone that was registered. I have all of your emails, and I will send out a special email to you with the PDF of this presentation, as well as a link to the YouTube and the Red Coral Universe presentation.
So rewatch it and share it with everybody, and join us next week, a week from today, on the 26th. I will be presenting a preview of a presentation to present this summer at ACNA, but it's on compassion, and it's the origination of the compassion programs and how that got started, and then Ryan's Law, which will be pointing right to the ASA website, and we're going to be walking you through how that works and how to talk to your legislators about a Ryan's Law version in your state as well. So join us on the 26th at 4:20 Pacific.
Yep. And so this has been a great show. Thank you all for joining. And as I like to end all of my podcasts and clinical conversations, remember what it's truly all about. It is about living your best life and helping others do the same. Thank you for joining us.
God bless.